This is Land of Havilah, Acts 24. The governor of Judea is holding Paul in custody in Caesarea. He told Paul he would hear his case when his accusers arrive. After he had kept Paul 5 days, verse 1. After 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with certain elders and an orator, one Tertullus. They informed the governor against Paul. Comment: the high priest and certain elders have come to Caesarea for the prosecution. They brought a certain orator, Tertullus. Coming up, Tertullus will present a very smooth and polished case against Paul. We get the idea he can make the guilty sound innocent and the innocent sound guilty. Coming up, he'll flatter Felix first, then go on to accuse Paul. Verse 2. When he was called, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, "Seeing that by you we enjoy much peace, and that prosperity is coming to this nation by your foresight, we accept it in all ways and in all places, most excellent Felix, with all thankfulness. But that I don't delay you, I entreat you to bear with us and hear a few words." Comment: Tertullus says, "I wish I had more time to tell you how wonderful you are, Felix, and how lucky we are to have you as governor. But since your time is so valuable, I'll get right down to business." He goes on, verse 5. "For we found this man to be a plague, an instigator of insurrections among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, and we arrested him. By examining yourself, you may ascertain all these things of which we accuse him. The Jews also joined in the attack, affirming that these things were so." Comment: probably verses 5 to 9 we just read are only a summary of what Tertullus said. The charges are only in generalities. That Paul was a plague? How so? That he instigates insurrections? Where? When? That he's a ringleader of the Nazarenes? What did the Nazarenes do? That he profaned the temple? How exactly? In verse 9 he says the Jews joined in the attack, affirming that these things are so, meaning the rioters in the street attacked him, which proves he's guilty. Verse 10. When the governor had beckoned to him to speak, Paul answered, "Because I know that you've been a judge of this nation for many years, I cheerfully make my defense. Seeing that you can verify that it's not more than 12 days since I went up to worship at Jerusalem, in the temple they didn't find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd, either in the synagogues or in the city, nor can they prove to you the things of which they now accuse me. But this I confess to you, that after the way, which they call a sect, so I serve the God of our fathers, believing all things which are according to the law, and which are written in the prophets, having hope toward God, which these also themselves look for, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and unjust." Comment: in verse 10, Paul says Felix has been governor for many years, and coming later it turns out that we're about 2 years from the end of his rule, meaning this trial took place around 58 AD, about 25 years after the crucifixion. In verse 11, it's not been more than 12 days since Paul arrived in Jerusalem. He laid low to purify himself when he came to Jerusalem, didn't speak in public, and only went to the temple to pray. Yet his reputation and recognition followed him so absolutely that a riot started without him doing anything. It's a testament to how outspoken and effective he was during his ministry, and how fearless he was to preach the gospel, knowing from many acts of violence already the reaction he was likely to get, yet he didn't quit. He was more interested in keeping his message pure than in watering it down. He could have easily said to himself, "If I stay away from the explosive stuff, I can prolong my ministry," but he didn't shrink back from the full counsel of God. In verse 14, Paul said he believes in all things according to the law of Moses and written in the prophets, which he made abundantly clear in his New Testament writings. In fact, the Old Testament law and prophets were the basis of his message, that the law and prophets were describing Jesus and predicting his coming. In verse 15, Paul said there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and unjust. Jesus said, quote, "A time's coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and will come out, those who did the good deeds to a resurrection of life, those who committed the bad deeds to a resurrection of judgment." John 5:28 and 29. And from the Old Testament, Daniel said, quote, "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt." Daniel 12:2. Regarding that judgment, Paul says, verse 16, Herein I also practice always having a conscience void of offense toward God and men. Comment, he says herein, meaning with regard to the coming judgment, he keeps a clean conscience. He conducts himself so he'll come out well in the judgment, and he warns others about the judgment. He goes on, verse 17. Now after some years I came to bring gifts for the needy to my nation, and offerings, amid which certain Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, not with a mob nor with turmoil. They ought to have been here before you, and to make accusation if they had anything against me. Or else let these men themselves say what injustice they found in me when I stood before the council. Unless it's for this one thing that I cried standing among them, concerning the resurrection of the dead, I'm being judged before you today. Comment, that's the end of Paul's defense. In verse 17, he said when he came to Jerusalem, he brought gifts to the needy and offerings. It's obvious he's written many of his letters by this point because he speaks in his epistles to the Romans, Corinthians, and Galatians about making a collection and sending it or taking it to Jerusalem. Coming up, Felix will end the proceedings. He says he won't make a final determination until the commander in Jerusalem comes down. Verse 22. But Felix, having more exact knowledge concerning the way, deferred them, saying, When Lysias, the commanding officer, comes down, I'll decide your case. He ordered the centurion that Paul should be kept in custody and should have some privileges, and not to forbid any of his friends to serve him or to visit him. Comment, in verse 22, Felix had a more exact knowledge of the way, meaning he knew more about Christianity than what was told him in court. In fact, coming up, his wife is a Jew, so she has the basic background to understand some things, and Felix will arrange for a meeting between her, Paul, and himself to hear more about his beliefs. Verse 24. But after some days, Felix came with Drusilla, his wife, who was a Jewess, and sent for Paul, and heard him concerning the faith in Christ Jesus. As he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was terrified, and answered, Go your way for this time, and when it's convenient for me, I'll summon you. Meanwhile, he also hoped that money would be given to him by Paul, that he might release him. Therefore also he sent for him more often and talked with him. But when 2 years were fulfilled, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring to gain favor with the Jews, Felix left Paul in bonds. Comment in verse 25, the fear of God came over Felix when Paul told him the gospel, but Felix wanted to avoid thinking about it. He said, I'll hear more about it later, which turned out to be a signal of his rejection of the gospel. He kept Paul in prison 2 years, hoping to receive a bribe from him, and passed from office without responding to the gospel, without receiving a bribe, and without releasing Paul. He hoped Paul would get up some money because he had a large following and had a chance to raise some money because he gave him access to visitors. As Felix was leaving office, he still kept Paul in prison to keep the Jews happy. The new governor is Porcius Festus. Acts 25 is next.